A very warm welcome. You're joining us tonight at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24 as we get closer to the 2024 presidential election. On the 21st of September, the largest list, the longest list of candidates in the fray for the presidential election. However, we're talking about policies. What policies are really essential for Sri Lanka to adopt for a vision beyond 2030, beyond 2040, beyond 2050, a longer-term vision for Sri Lanka to achieve economic development, policy consistency and overall development in the country. I've invited to our studios a public health expert, a physician, as well as an economist who will talk to us about Sri Lanka's current situation, what economic measures he sees as important for Sri Lanka to undertake going forward. Let me warmly welcome Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya, economist, physician, public health expert. You were educated in Cambridge as a public health specialist, but
physician, public health at Harvard.
At Harvard,
yeah.
Interesting. And somehow you're an economist as well.
So I did basically health economics for my doctoral degree, so basically it was an economics training.
Mm-hmm. And where was that?
That was Harvard.
Harvard as well,
yeah.
Okay. We're indeed pleased to have you here at our studios, Dr. Rannan-Eliya. I'd like to start off with the elections. Yeah. A number of policy documents, manifestos as we call, have been presented by at least the top 5 candidates. And they talk about various and varying, they give pledges to transform Sri Lanka in what they seem fit for the country. But let us talk about where we are today and what's missing for the country in your eyes.
Sure. I mean, I think in general terms, I think most people in Sri Lanka understand it. It's the basic #1 problem is the economy and what the basis is for long-term economic growth. So I think that is the basic problem. Obviously, we've made serious policy errors under successive governments and ended up in essentially this economy imploded in 2022. The political system imploded as well. Government collapsed. And I think that's what most people are concerned about. So how do we redress the economic situation? I think in the long term, how do we lay the basis for sustained, rapid economic growth, which I think is important, I would say, for 2 reasons. One is that's probably what people want. They want higher living standards, and I think they want greater opportunities that come with that. So I think that in itself is important. And then the other reason I would say is purely geopolitical. We're a small country. We know we're next to a very big country. We're in a fast-growing economic region. I think our ability to exercise sovereignty in this more multipolar world also depends on us having a robust economy which is much bigger than it is currently. So I think that it's important for both those reasons.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think before I speak much about economics or Sri Lanka's situation, I'm still curious to know how a physician, public health expert really went into economics and how that, what drove you, what inspired you to study both?
That's a long story, but if I can go back in time, I probably wanted to do both even before I went to medical school. But I was admitted as a medical student, because that's how you apply to university at Cambridge, and as I did my initial medical training, the initial what they call preclinical, in 2 years of study. It usually is 3. And then under the Cambridge system, technically you can do another subject for your final year. I did ask to do economics, and I was told, no, you cannot do that. You're a medical student, you cannot do economics. So I ended up doing essentially political science, because I thought that was easier, I don't know. So I had that desire even then, and I completed my medical training. And then, because I was more interested, I think, in the health policy side as opposed to the community medicine aspect of public health, I was advised by somebody very well known, who probably wasn't well known at the time in the UK, gave me very good career advice. He said, he was British, he said, don't stay here. He said, go to the US. He had, it's actually Sir Michael Marmot, some people may know him. And that's what I did. He had gone to the US himself. And I went to graduate school, I got into Harvard. And so I did public health initially, then worked as a member of faculty in global health, in health systems, health financing. So you can see there's already some economics there. And then worked in that area for about 3 or 4 years in Latin America, Africa, and Asia with Harvard. And then decided I needed to go back to graduate school to get a formal training. So I went back to do technically health economics, but the way it was taught in my program, essentially I did 2 years of solid economics coursework, the kind of PhD coursework you do for an economics degree, but came out with a degree in health economics. So that's sort of how I covered all those.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But coming back to Sri Lanka, how does it feel to be here in Sri Lanka? Our health system quite advanced compared to what's in South Asia. Free health, but still we face crisis year after year, whether it's the drugs, medicine, the quality and the standards of procurement. We've seen these issues roll out year after year.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I would not compare our health system with the rest of South Asia even. I mean, the health system is, in a sense, the jewel, one of the jewels in the crown of Sri Lanka's political economy. It's one of the jewels in the crown of our democracy, right? So one thing I would note that, I mean, we are rightfully proud that we have been ruled by elected government since 1931. One of the very explicit reasons that the Donoughmore Commission gave for introducing universal suffrage in the 1920s, and I should note, before British women had the opportunity to vote on an equal basis in a British election, the British Donoughmore Commissioners recommended the franchise to women. And one of the reasons, it's in the report, was to improve health conditions. So this is sort of baked into our political system. Now, they could not have foreseen what would happen, but I think that vision was correct. And so our health system is superlative, not just by South Asian standards, it's by even Southeast Asian standards, even East Asian standards. There are only a few others which are better, and even in global terms. So there's almost no developing country at our income level which achieves the health outcomes we get, and for such a long period, and does so with such low health spending, and also ensures that most people in the country do have access to basic care when they need it. So this is a very great achievement. So I would say, yes, it's a jewel in the crown. In terms of the recent, I think the specific issues you mentioned, like medicines, I mean, I think I would probably separate this into two parts. I think there are long-running challenges which have existed for 30, 40 years. It's sort of why I work in this area, so it's been there in my whole professional life. And then I think there were obviously, so those are chronic challenges. And then there were these acute problems that arose during the economic collapse, particularly the medicines issue, which arose, which I think fundamentally, and I saw the former minister was apparently released from remand, if I understand correctly, recently. I think those problems were acute problems that were brought on by the fiscal collapse. If you really dig deep, it was a fiscal crisis, and that made things even worse. So I think that's what happened. I'm happy to talk about the broader problems, but I think it was existing problems which then became highly exacerbated at that point. And I think one part of that is, and this is not well appreciated, particularly I think by better off Sri Lankans. The health system we have is actually quite cost efficient. I know it's fashionable, maybe English-speaking middle class, to say the public sector is inefficient. The reality is, first of all, our health system is efficient, but the public sector part of it is one of the most cost-efficient delivery systems in the world. And it operates at the margin, on a shoestring, in effect. And so when the fiscal crisis hit, so it's always doing that, it's always operating at the margin, always has some kind of shortfalls because there's not enough cash. It's very efficient, but it just needs the extra cash. When the fiscal crisis happened, the budget collapsed. And so then there was no room, no slack to absorb the impact, which I think some other countries might have been able to do in the situation. There was really no room to do it by efficiency gains. And so what happened was essentially the bottom fell out. So there was this huge problem in medicine shortages, and then all sorts of other crises which have been discussed. I don't want to make allegations against people, and I think there are some court proceedings going on. But I think those are all the consequences, yeah. I'm happy to go into the details of that, but basically we have a health system which is actually quite optimal, but it operates under limited funding. And most of the challenges in the health system, historically, chronically, are related to the fact we have low levels of funding in relation to the kind of health system we have and what probably people want.
Sri Lanka's current healthcare spending is at some 4.07% of GDP. Politicians promise, pledge to increase
that is wrong. I mean, sorry, do you mean public spending or total?
This is healthcare spending, government budget. Is that, if I'm not mistaken?
No, you said GDP. Sorry, GDP.
Yes.
GDP.
They pledged to increase it up to 5% of GDP.
Who did?
The politicians who are vying for presidency.
I haven't read the manifestos in detail, but sure, I'll take you on your word.
If I'm not mistaken again. And the healthcare budget in 2023 was some 110 billion rupees. Economics of health you were talking about. What does this mean for Sri Lanka? You mentioned that our public health system, it's efficient, running on bare minimum spending. But for those in need, those who need this healthcare system, how do we look at this kind of spending?
Sure. So let me just get some figures correct here. So our total health spending by the whole nation, including private sources, people paying out of pocket, that's households, or private insurance, has been in the range of about 3.2 to 3.5% of GDP, pretty much the past 20 years. So it's not 4, it's about 3.5%. Government spending has been around 1.5 to 1.7% of GDP. That is our gross overall national resources. Both spending levels are, I mean, the private spending level, which is about half of that, so it's around 1.5% of GDP, a bit more than that. That's not particularly high, but it's definitely not low. I mean, it's sort of what you might expect. Public spending is low for our income level. So the 1.6, 1.5% of GDP is low. Now I should explain on the numbers. There's some complications with the numbers recently. There was some increase in spending during 2020-21 because of COVID, because the government made these emergency purchases of COVID vaccines, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So that sort of pushed up spending, and of course the economy was contracting. So I think there's a, I would say, temporary aberration. But historically, we're talking about 1.6% of GDP government, about 1.7 private, half-half. Now, what does that mean? I told you we have this jewel of a system which provides very extensive healthcare service. And I'll just give you a couple of indicators of this. Sri Lankans go to a qualified physician on average 6 to 7 times a year. That's higher than in most European countries, right? It's higher than New Zealand. We get admitted to hospital around 30 times a year per 100 people. This is higher than 90% of the European countries. I'm not even talking about developing countries. You see, I'm just making reference to rich countries. And so we have very high levels of healthcare access, much higher than typical developing countries. We're doing it with this 3% of GDP, half of which is public. So the way we've done that is that although care is free in practice, if you really want free care, you can get it. That's a great thing. It's not available in quantity at that free price for everyone, at the level that everyone will be happy with. And so what we've had to do, it is part of the system. The public sector provides about half the care, and better off people, probably like you and me, we go to the private sector voluntarily and pay out of pocket, and if we're lucky, maybe like Derana, I guess you have private insurance. Some of us may have private insurance from our employer to pay for some of that. And so the system depends on that happening. If all those better off people went into the public sector, it would not be able to cope. The public sector preferentially ends up treating the poorer people, and most people get care in some way from the public or private sector. So this is the kind of the miracle of our system. It's unusual because most public sectors in developing countries do not reach the poor well. Ours does, and ours does because we have healthcare facilities pretty much every square inch of this country. There's at least every square kilometer there is a public health clinic or hospital. That's unusual. They are free to access. Many countries they still charge. In parts of India and Indonesia they still charge fees. We get free care if you're poor, and nobody questions you. There's no attempt to try and means test, which doesn't make a lot of sense from an economic perspective. So that's what we're doing. But there is a shortage. Now the shortage is partly dealt with people, the better off like us, essentially implicitly being told for years, encouraged to use private services. The other rationing that goes on is particularly in medicines. So in the public sector, you can get a prescription for free, but the medicines may not be available. This is a chronic long-term problem. The medicines budget is not sufficient. And the way we've handled this, I think from the UNP-JR period back in the 70s, the rule was introduced, if the hospital doesn't have in stock the medicines, it's transparently told to patients, they can take the prescription to the private pharmacy, right? And so and then I think doctors historically have sometimes told the better off patients to do that anyway, to say the medicines are better outside, and that's sort of helped. So we have this shortage of medicines in the public sector, which is long-standing, makes some people go to the private sector, they get the prescription, and that causes a lot of unhappiness and a lot of problems. People, particularly with chronic diseases, have issues, and it was all exacerbated when in 21, 22, 23 by the effect of fiscal crisis. So we have this system. It's relatively equal, high levels of coverage, but it depends on both public and private components, and the private part is critical because public funding is so low.
I feel like I'm speaking a lot on health,
sure.
Very much because of your expertise.
Health, yes.
We've promised to talk about elections, but this question is also about health. Yes, it's a major issue here in Sri Lanka. An aging population, 25% of Sri Lankans will be over 50 or over 60 rather in 15 years, and Sri Lanka's healthcare system should be modernized or should be able to accommodate this growing need for our aging population. Again, the manifestos I have here, the health, the changes that our top contenders plan to invest in healthcare, either attract investments or modernize healthcare, have new centers, focus on mental health. But how do you suggest? You have experience in the Western world. You've been educated there. You're Sri Lankan. You depend on the Sri Lankan healthcare system while you're here. What does it mean for our aging population to have these politicians really pledge these, but on the ground level, what changes do you suggest should be implemented?
So I think it is normal and universal that all the political parties and presidential candidates at every elections promise improvements and expansions in healthcare. That's a given. That's why I probably don't read their manifesto, because I already know that it's in there, right? The problem is that no government for more than 4 decades has addressed the reason why it's not possible to substantially improve coverage. The constraint is the public budget. 1.6, 1.7% of GDP. Our institute tracks health spending. We've been doing that for many decades. Since 1990, it's been flat. In all other Asian countries and other developing countries and rich countries, as incomes went up, like it did in the past 30 years in Sri Lanka, healthcare spending by government as a share of GDP went up. Ours was flat, right? And so all these nice, pious words, in my view, mean nothing unless we fix the public budget issue. That is the constraint. That hasn't gone up. Now, I think that many politicians, all parties, may want increases in health spending, but they can't. Why haven't they been able to do it? There wasn't enough taxes in the country. Our tax collection has been going down since the 1980s, 1970s. And so that fundamental fiscal constraint has meant that I think governments have tried to protect the health budget. So when I said that, the government health budget has been sort of flat to 1.6, 1.7% of GDP for so long, in a sense, if you look at some of the other ministries, it was falling. So I know that successive governments have tried to protect health, but they don't have the fiscal ammunition to substantially improve coverage beyond gains that have been made through efficiency improvements. So the health sector has expanded care through efficiency gains. That's why I say it's one of the most efficient in the world. Now, in terms of aging, we are going to need a lot more money. Even efficiency, we've done calculation, is not going to be enough. And then the other big thing about aging, which is not well understood, is the issue, what they call in rich countries, long-term care. This is not really a medical issue. This is that when you get very old, like my mother, and I don't know whether you have parents or grandparents, they become physically weak and unable to look after themselves, right? They may need help to wash. They may need help to go to the toilet. They may need somebody to make them food, right? This is needs something called long-term care. Now, rich capitalist countries, what do? This is increasingly gets funded by the public sources. Why? Because, if you have a 90-year-old or an 80-year-old who needs a social care person, somebody to help that person feed or bathe, that needs a person, right? Can't use robots yet. And that needs to be paid. And those people cannot pay for that. These very old people in their 80s, 70s, when most of us are not going to be able to afford that. And so most rich countries have public financing. That typically costs now 2 to 4% of GDP, more than our current health budget. So the big problem we now have is with aging. It's a real problem. We probably do not have the fiscal ammunition to really provide meaningful services.
Do you think our authorities understand this requirement, this growing need to provide for the aging population? You spoke about your mother. We all, I think, have that responsibility, especially diseases that we probably think are alien to us. We know little of. Alzheimer's, dementia.
Yes.
Sri Lanka is seeing a large population of the aging group that is falling prey to these diseases. But do we understand? How do we spend on health education, awareness on these to take care of our elders efficiently?
So there has been increasing awareness of the aging challenge, not just for healthcare and social care, but also pensions, from, I would say, definitely since President Chandrika's time. But the problem is none of the governments have dealt with the basic issue. This is a fiscal problem. It needs taxes. It needs public money. Right? Even if you use insurance, it's social insurance has to be used for. It's not private. Private insurance cannot cover this. It's not really an insurable thing. But social insurance is a form of taxation. So it needs more taxation. And remember, all this time since before Chandrika, we've been cutting taxes. So it's never, I think they understand there might be an issue. I think many affluent people know because they have relatives who need, when they get older, need this care. It seems to be quite commonplace. And I think increasing dementia, I think many people I know, their parents have dementia, right? So this is, I think people know from their lived experience. But where the policymakers and even the bureaucrats don't understand is some of them still think, oh, the families can look after it. Right? They think some Asian cultural thing, the Asian cultural thing. Well, come on, guys. If you go to Japan, Korea, very Asian countries, they're putting public money. They recognize it cannot be left to families to sort out. Even Singapore, which, they have a law saying you must look after your parents. If you don't, you can get fined, I guess, or sent to jail. Even Singapore has had to increase substantially public spending on looking after its elderly. So I think there's this problem, and I think this other problem that we face is people think for any spending problem, they think, tax exemptions. Yeah, even in bureaucracy, even in our bureaucracy, it's not just the politicians. We have a political and I would say social elite who have drunk the Kool-Aid on tax cuts and tax exemptions, and any problem they're faced with. And I've sat in meetings where I've seen very senior officials come up with this, and this is after the economic crisis, right? I mean, this is what I find crazy: tax cuts. We want aged care. We'll give tax cuts to the private sector to provide, right? And it doesn't address the problem that the people who need the aged care, they can't afford to pay anyway. So what are you going to do? I mean, this is I think reflects. So I think health is suffering, but for me as a health person, the basic problem is economic fiscal policy, and our basic challenge is what we do about the country's public finances.
Economic fiscal policy, healthcare, the IMF, and Sri Lanka's economy at large. We'll speak about this much more when we come back after this short break. We're in conversation with physician, public health expert, and economist Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We're in conversation with Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya, Executive Director of the Institute for Health Policy. Dr. Rannan-Eliya, we've been talking about healthcare spending, public spending, the budgets, why Sri Lanka, with an efficient public healthcare system, is still lagging in areas of taking care of the aging population. But the overall economy, I promised to talk about the economy. The major question is the IMF, whether to continue, whether to renegotiate, or to do away with this. Can Sri Lanka afford to do away with the IMF? These are questions that are, well, being highlighted on public platforms during the elections. But what really should be our choice here for a country as Sri Lanka, plunged into a deep economic crisis, and now here we are at crucial elections to elect the executive of the country?
I think my sense is that all the major political parties agree that we should remain in some agreement with the IMF. Even though I hear people alleging otherwise, even if you read the MPP manifesto, I did read their IMF part of it, and before I came for this, they very clearly indicate that they intend to remain in agreement with the IMF. So I think everyone agrees about this. I think it is unavoidable. As a sovereign country, we could break our agreement with the IMF and kick them out. But I don't think anyone will want to do that, because if we do that, we essentially lose access to all foreign capital. We will have significant problems accessing foreign markets, blah, 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 blah. So I don't think that's an option. And I think politicians have figured that out. But I think the real issue is not so much whether we have an agreement with the IMF, we have one, but I think it's more about the details of that agreement and what kind of partnership we have with the IMF, and what should we be doing through that collective agreement. So I think that's really where the questions are. So are you suggesting we renegotiate or look at the IMF agreement? Is that something Sri Lanka can afford to do at this stage? As far as my understanding, as a sovereign country, as a member of the IMF, we are always entitled to renegotiate with the IMF or these international institutions to come up with a different agreement. When you say negotiate, it implies a mutual agreement. So I think that there's nothing that says we cannot. I mean, come on, countries around the world have repeatedly flouted their IMF agreements and fallen out, and we have done the same, right? The previous administration, the one elected in 2016, made an IMF agreement, and then they sort of fell out. So, we have a track record on this, right? There's nothing against it. But I think the issue is, if we want to stay in this, we need to, we probably should renegotiate the terms. And I think that's...
Why? In what areas?
I think in several areas. And I think this is not always a criticism. I wouldn't count it as just a criticism of what was done. I think what was done initially was a necessity, and so things may have done, for reasons of time and expediency to get it signed. But I think that, with time we can do better. And I think the things that worry me about the current agreement, which essentially is dictating fiscal policy here, which it should, is, I think several things. One is, and I think this has been pointed out by others. I think Dr. Shamini Kore has, ex-IMF, Sri Lankan IMF for sure, has pointed this out. We have a problem that my own view is that the tax target is far too low. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a tax target which is mutually agreed. The government proposed it, the IMF accepted it. Right? Are
you saying we need to have more taxes?
Yes. Mm. The current tax target is around 15% of GDP. I believe we reached about 12-13% this year. Right? We were at 7% a year or 2 years ago, right? After the previous tax cuts and economic collapse. 15% of GDP is, my personal view, is, and based on data actually, but still leaves us as essentially a low tax economy. And that low tax collection of 15% of GDP is not going to be sufficient to lay the basis for robust, sustained, rapid economic growth. And I think more importantly from a political perspective, it will not provide the basis for long-term political stability of a regime, that is a regime who wants to win another election. Why do I say that? The 15% of GDP, first of all, it's low. I know people complain about high tax, some people. But as compared to other countries, what's our peer economy comparison? Well, we're talking about 18 to 25% of GDP. Yeah, and I should just say as a technical data point, sometimes people look at the general revenue numbers. Now, in our case, we fund health through taxes. Mm. Some countries, China, Vietnam, fund healthcare through Social Security. Mm-hmm. And so that doesn't always appear when people look at these tax numbers, but you should consider that taxation, right? But basically, we're talking about peer economies who are competitive exporters, who are growing faster than us, who have bigger market economies, who are doing better on capitalism than us. Their tax takes are 18 to 25, 27% of GDP, right? We're a low tax economy, that's right. So that's the first thing to know. Now, why is 15% not enough beyond the fact that it's a low number? It's not enough when you consider that we blew up our debt, right? We have a debt to reach 130% of GDP. So in order to stabilize the debt, which is the IMF's primary concern, we have to make debt repayments on top of any haircuts we get on the debt from our creditors. The debt repayments are 7 to 8% of GDP. You do the math, 15 minus 7, right? It only leaves 7 to 8% of GDP every year to pay for all the things that government does, which is not just health and education. Right. It's paying for the court system, it's paying for roads, it's paying for the military, national security, the police, all these other things, income transfers for the poor, food assistance. That's from 7 to 8% of GDP. I told you our health budget is 1.6. Mm. There was a government, there was an administration that came in a few years ago with a manifesto promise. Manifestos don't mean anything, of course, but manifesto promise of 6% of GDP on education. You remember that? Mm-hmm. 6%. Yeah. How do you do that with a government budget after debt repayment of 6 to 7?
But where do you propose these taxes come from, Dr. Rannan-Eliya? We're talking about professionals here disgruntled about the higher taxation, corporates, and with value-added tax increased, consumers are upset about it. But where do you think these taxes come from? And there are other people who say, you have to tax the right people. Look for the money that's hidden.
So I think there are two parts to this. Clearly, a significant part of our tax problem, the tax hole, and even the IMF has pointed this out, is an issue of tax policy. Mm-hmm. We have exempted large sections of our formal economy from taxation historically. Now, originally, I think in the 70s, it started as a pro-exporter kind of incentive, right? But it then, because of the political system, it metamorphosed into everyone else pretty much gets the tax exemption. right? So even private hospitals get the tax exemption, right? I'm going to give you, it's a little anecdote. The hospitals didn't have the tax exemption from the BOI originally. Then I think it was Mr. Nawaloko went to President Premadasa and said, oh, I want to import this MRI machine. We don't have many. Give me a tax exemption. So I think the BOI exemptions were extended to the private sector. And then the argument was, oh, we're going to treat all these foreign patients. We'll get all these tourists, we can get this modern equipment, and we'll earn money for the country. Guess what happened? Companies are not stupid. I would do the same. The private hospital sector essentially relabeled as new subsidiaries and set up new subsidiaries to make use of these tax privileges. So guess what? After 30, 40 years, 90% of our private hospital bed capacity operates under BOI exemptions, which were originally meant to support exports. Right?
Right.
And even the old hospitals, they just set up a new subsidiary and then you transfer into that. And so, has it led to an increase in tourists being treated? Medical tourism? No.
I doubt so.
So the benefits were never achieved, and we just exempted the whole private hospital sector from taxation, or at least from the taxes that they're exempt from under BI. So I think there's tax policies about what's exempted. There's also issues of tax administration. So I think it's well known that the administration competency of the Ministry of Finance, the revenue departments, particularly since the, I would say since the early 90s, has fallen. Part of that, I mean, I think Mick Moore has pointed this out, we've never had a proper finance minister since the early 90s. The last proper finance minister in this country was Ronnie DeMel. Ever since then, the president or the prime minister, they've become the finance minister. How can you do that, right? Even today, it's basically Ranil Wickremesinghe is the finance minister, right? So I think we need a much greater effort on tax collection. It's archaic, it's inefficient, and that will help raise taxes and maybe bring down the rates, but we also need to expand what is taxed. Now, the other third problem, which I think is one of the problems with the IMF agreement, our long-term prosperity, like the rest of Asia, like Europe historically, depends on export-led manufacturing. For the next 2-3 decades, there's no way out of it. No country in Asia, except the Maldives, which is about to go bankrupt anyway, has become rich other than through export-led manufacturing.
You speak about export-led manufacturing. I think the incumbent presidents have spoken about it, other leaders of political parties. But do you think we have the capacity to really drive this export-oriented manufacturing in Sri Lanka? Manufacturing.
Do you mean, are you asking, are Sri Lankans capable of that?
Do we have the infrastructure, the capacity to cater to the demands of the global market?
So we all start from nothing. So I'll ask you, are you asking whether Sri Lankans are capable of doing that?
Oh, we are certainly capable.
Sure,
but do you think we have the infrastructure? Do you think we have the ability to really invest in this? Everyone talks about it, but no work has been done in terms of laying the foundation.
So I would say there are two things. We don't have a better choice. Whether it's hard or easy, we don't have another better choice. If we want our grandkids to live in a rich country, I would like that. I don't know about you. I would like my grandkids to live in a rich country, right? And I don't want to sound so materialistic, but there are big benefits from being rich as a country. We have no choice. We have to get this done. Right? And we have to sustain it for at least 2-3 decades. Now, just a couple of historical points. When Sri Lanka started with nothing in 1978, one of the most inward closed economies in the world at that time, with very limited infrastructure, very limited industry, and we pursued export promotion policies and policies which encouraged exports, particularly garments. Sri Lanka, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, was I think the first or the second fastest growing export manufacturer in the world. We have done it, right? And then after the JVP insurgency under President Premadasa, when he again reinvigorated that push, we also grew our exports very fast. We grew foreign investment very fast, early 90s, right? I still remember that. So it is possible, but I think the problem has been a policy problem. So the overall policy framework, which was I would say under President Premadasa, and I'm not saying this as, I'm politically neutral, I'm not saying this as an advert for his son, so let me be clear about that. But under President Premadasa, there was, like in many other East Asian countries historically, a laser focus on exports. You're probably not old enough, but I still remember in the 90s, people thought this crazy man, Premadasa, he was putting billboards around the country saying 90s are the export decade and we were going to get $1,000 per capita GDP and double or triple exports. People thought he was crazy. It was working, right? Laser-minded focus. The president every month would sit with exporters and civil servants and go with them and discuss what the problems were and get them fixed. Guess what? I would say that since the assassination of President Premadasa, we have not had any political leader, including UNP leaders, who have prioritized exports. So I know the president says prioritize exports. He had like 2 or 3 major export strategies during the last administration, but the focus was not there. And there are things that we need to do. So like even with the IMF agreement, which Roger was discussing originally, that many of these tax changes raise taxes, but they're not pro-export. Like the VAT changes, I mean, the VAT system should be done in a way to incentivize and make exporters more profitable than everybody else. Yeah? Other people are going to hurt, but we want the export businesses to be profitable, and we want the non-exporters, if necessary, to go out of business. That's actually realistically that we need to retransfer capital, right? We have a lot of our conglomerates, as you know, I don't know who owns you, but there's a lot of our conglomerates, they put their money in condominium, real estate. That's not exports, right? Or in all sorts of domestic industries, not exports. We want them to shrink that capital allocation and put it in exports. So we have to change the profit margins, and because of all the other problems that the exporters face, and the current IMF thing doesn't really do that. I mean, it does give us a bit more of a realistic exchange rate, but I don't think the exchange rate is competitive enough. We need to, I think, aggressively devalue our currency. I know politically difficult, but I think that's what East Asia did. That's what the United States did in the 1800s. So this is not some weird thing from outside.
I'm told we have a few minutes left, but you mentioned policy, you stressed on policy changes. I'm not asking you, I don't think it's ethical to talk about whom to vote, but what should we vote for? What should we look out for? The policy changes, you spoke about policy, we'll stick to policy, the key policy. Let's name 5 policies that you would like brought in to see that develop Sri Lanka. Young people aspire for a developed country, to live in a richer country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard choice. I'm a voter too, and I would say as a voter, I don't see a very appealing choice. And the way I personally would look at it, I said I don't really check their manifestos, because let's be honest, I think it was Rani who said many years ago, manifestos, nobody believes them, you don't have to follow them after you win. In fact, he said something like that. The fact is, I'm trying to figure out from what they say in public, and maybe people I know, which the average voter may not have access to, what do you think they would do? I don't know, honestly. I think that, if I had to comment very briefly, I think the Ranil Wickramasinghe's manifesto partly reflects that he is the incumbent president. He's had to sign some of these. So he's sort of sticking with that. I mean, he cannot repudiate it. So it's, and some of what the IMF has forced us to do is in the correct direction. So improve foreign exchange earnings, raise taxation. I think he has no choice, but even if he did opposite things when he was previously in power, but he's going with that. I think the question I would ask is, and I don't know, I think the basic 2 issues on the economic side, we have to, I think in the long run, raise taxes well above 15% of GDP, say to 20% at the end of a parliamentary term, which would allow us to pay our debt back faster, get debt repayments down faster, and invest in the economic infrastructure for rapid growth, and also the social services that people want, Sri Lankans want. So I think that's what I would want, and I think a laser focus on exports that has to be sustained. Now, it's very hard to know, because all these politicians tell you beautiful words, what they would actually do. And so I have to say, I don't know.
With a minute to go, I just have one last question. Your stance on health education, especially medical education here in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I mean, I think our medical education system is good.
And private education, rather.
Yes, I think the problem with, I mean, I went to, as you may know, I went to Harvard and did public health, which is a private institution in the United States. But my kind of view is the issue is of quality. So all rich capitalist economies tightly regulate the quality of medical education, right? And some, like Singapore, even control who gets into medical school, and it's not based just on marks, right? They don't like Singaporeans, they didn't like girls going to medical school because they'll waste the investment, or they don't want the brightest people to go to medical school, they want them to do engineering. So there was a policy those days in Singapore not to let the brightest students go into med. So there is regulation, control in a capitalist economy. The issue is our medical system, education system is of very high quality. Our doctors are able to get through foreign exams much easier than graduates from other countries. So we should be glad of that. It's helped us maintain an efficient health system. The problem with all the previous proposals for private medical schools is that they're usually based on political connections, and they attempt to bypass the quality controls. So they will say, we'll set up this school, and then they try to pressure the medical council to lower the standards. And so and then the other issue of this, it's very hard for a private medical school to provide medical students with the clinical case exposure to become a good doctor when 95% of our inpatients are in the public sector. So the idea that you could have a private medical school like in Harvard, which depends only on private sector patients, not easy here. So I think if we're worried about quality, and we need to care about quality because of the it's a system which is underfunded, so quality matters much more, then I think we have to be very careful. And I have to say all previous attempts to do this essentially with political interference have failed on the quality issue. Now the other issue is, what's the point of training people in medical schools if there's no budget to employ them to treat people? The poor person is not going to benefit. So I would much rather see politicians and governments addressing the underfunding of the core health system, also allow us to raise wages of doctors. Our doctors are underpaid. Why do they do private practice? They do private practice because they're underpaid. We have to give them that. The British gave them that right in the 1800s, special privilege, because they underpaid the doctors in Sri Lanka. And so we do that. If we want to address this issue, this training, private training schools, I think it addresses the desire of upper middle income or middle income Sri Lankan families to get their kids through medical school because it's very socially desirable. But it's not sound public policy intended to improve healthcare. For that, we need basic core public financing.
I think that's all the time we have here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Thank you very much, Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya, for joining us tonight. I wish we had more time to discuss a number of issues, but I think your expertise on healthcare, public health and economics really helped us discuss the elections, Sri Lanka's policy. Thank you once again for your time. We were in conversation with economist, physician, public health specialist, Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya, who has undertaken research in a number of areas and consulted in more than 30 countries, working with the World Bank, ADB and the World Health Organization. We'll see you again next week with yet another conversation here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Until then, have a pleasant evening. Take care. Good night.